Section 1, The Bride Who Wore a Black Veil. It was, by all accounts, a wedding designed to be remembered. The gardens of Château Valenquet lay bathed in late afternoon light, the pale stone terraces glowing softly beneath a sky of immaculate blue. White roses climbed the balustrades, their scent drifting lazily over the assembled guests, men in tailored morning coats, women shimmering in silks and pearls, all murmuring with that restrained excitement peculiar to high society gatherings. A string quartet played something delicate and optimistic, and champagne glasses caught the sun like scattered diamonds. Yet amid all this brightness, there was one detail that unsettled everyone who saw it. The bride wore black. Not mourning black, exactly, not the heavy crepe of a widow, but a fine, elegant veil of jet-colored lace, draped lightly over her face. Beneath it, her gown was ivory, exquisitely cut, but the veil fell like a shadow over her features, transforming joy into something disturbingly ambiguous. Guests whispered behind gloved hands. A few smiled uneasily, as though unsure whether this was fashion, symbolism, or some private joke they were not meant to understand. Hercule Poirot noticed it at once. He stood slightly apart from the crowd, hands folded neatly over the silver head of his walking stick, his immaculate mustaches twitching with restrained disapproval. Order, to Poirot, was not merely aesthetic, it was moral. A wedding was a celebration of harmony. A black veil was, a contradiction. Mon ami, Captain Hastings murmured beside him, surely these continental customs are more flexible than ours? Poirot inclined his head, though his eyes never left the bride. Customs, yes. But symbolism, no. A bride who introduces darkness into her own ceremony, Hastings, is making a statement. The question is, what statement? The groom, Julien Montrevel, waited at the foot of the marble steps leading down into the garden. Tall, handsome, heir to one of France's oldest families, he looked every inch the confident aristocrat, though Poirot observed a faint tension in the set of his jaw. He smiled when the bride approached, yet it was the smile of a man aware that something precious was balanced on a knife's edge. The bride, Elise Montrevel, née Armand, descended slowly, her gloved hand resting on her uncle's arm. Her movements were graceful, controlled. Too controlled, Poirot thought. Not the nervous excitement of a young woman in love, but the composure of someone who had already made peace with a difficult decision. As the officiant began to speak, a hush fell over the gathering. Even the birds seemed to pause in their songs. Poirot felt it then, the subtle tightening in the air, that almost imperceptible shift he had learned to recognize over decades. The moment when life, orderly and predictable, prepared itself to fracture. The vows began. Julien spoke first, his voice clear, resonant, promising fidelity and devotion. He looked at Elise with something close to reverence. Then it was her turn. She lifted her chin. Beneath the black lace, her lips parted. She began. She never finished the sentence. A sharp crack split the air, loud and obscene against the gentleness of the music. For a heartbeat, no one understood what had happened. Then Elise stiffened, her body arching backward as though pulled by invisible strings. The black veil fluttered, slipping from her face as she collapsed onto the pale stone path. Screams erupted. Chairs scraped. Someone dropped a glass, and it shattered. Poirot did not move. He watched as chaos unfolded, men rushing forward, women crying, the officiant frozen in horror. Blood bloomed darkly against the ivory of the bride's gown, a cruel echo of the veil she had worn moments before. Julien knelt beside her, his hands trembling as he tried to lift her head. Elise! Elise, my love, someone help! But Poirot already knew. He stepped forward, his expression grave, his voice calm yet authoritative. Non. Do not move her. Hastings stared at him. Poirot, how can you possibly? Poirot crouched beside the fallen bride, his keen eyes noting details others overlooked. The faint scent of bitter almonds. The absence of any visible wound. The unnatural stillness of her fingers. "This is no accident," Poirot said softly. "And no gunshot, despite the sound." He straightened, surveying the crowd, faces pale, eyes wide, each reflecting shock, and something else. Fear, perhaps. Or relief. "The sound you heard," Poirot continued, "was designed to distract you. To send your thoughts in the wrong direction." A servant pushed through the gathering, breathless. "Monsieur. The police, should I send for them?" Poirot nodded. "Immediately." As the man hurried away, Poirot turned his gaze once more to the bride's unveiled face. In death, Elise Armand looked younger, almost peaceful. Yet even now, there was something defiant in the line of her mouth. "She knew," Poirot murmured. "Knew what?" Hastings asked. "That today would not end in happiness." Around them, the guests murmured in stunned disbelief. Some clung to one another, others stood rigid, as though afraid to draw attention to themselves. Poirot observed them all, the groom's distraught sorrow, the tight-lipped silence of Elise's relatives, the flicker of calculation in more than one pair of eyes. A closed circle, here in this sunlit garden. Wealth. Secrets. Motives layered beneath polite smiles. And at the center of it all, a bride who had chosen to wear a black veil on the day of her death. Poirot drew a slow breath, feeling the familiar stirring of his little gray cells. "A wedding," he said quietly to Hastings, "is supposed to unite. Instead, this one has exposed fractures long hidden. Before the day is over, mon ami, we shall discover that this veil was not merely an ornament, but a warning." He glanced once more at the silent form on the stones. "And someone here," Poirot added, his eyes narrowing, "has just committed the gravest of betrayals." Section 2, The Gathering of Suspects. By the time the police arrived, the gardens of Château Valenquet had transformed from a scene of celebration into one of restrained dread. The guests were ushered indoors, away from the white roses and shattered illusion of joy. The grand salon, normally a place of music, laughter, and polished civility, now hummed with nervous whispers and the rustle of uneasily shifting bodies. Heavy velvet curtains muted the sunlight, casting the room in a somber half-light that felt uncomfortably appropriate. Elise Montrevel lay upstairs, attended by a doctor who had already confirmed what Poirot knew the moment he knelt beside her: she had been dead before she hit the ground. Poison. And not administered by chance. Poirot stood near the fireplace, hands clasped behind his back, surveying the assembled company with quiet intensity. He did not rush. He never did. People, he knew, revealed far more when they believed they were simply waiting. Captain Hastings remained close, his face troubled. "Surely, Poirot," he whispered, "anyone could have slipped something into her system earlier in the day. At breakfast, perhaps. Or during the preparations." Poirot inclined his head slightly. "Possible, yes. But not probable. Poison chosen for drama, Hastings. For timing. The victim was meant to die at a precise moment, before witnesses, in the midst of vows. That tells us something of the killer's psychology." Before Hastings could ask what, the doors opened and the local magistrate entered with 2 uniformed officers. After brief introductions, Poirot, already known to them by reputation, was courteously invited to assist. "The family insists," the magistrate said quietly. "And given the circumstances, we have agreed." Poirot smiled faintly. "You are most wise, monsieur." The doors were closed. No one was permitted to leave. A collective unease settled over the room as that fact became clear. Eyes darted. Shoulders stiffened. The realization dawned that this tragedy was not an external intrusion, it had come from within. Poirot gestured gently. "If you please, we shall begin by understanding who is present." One by one, the suspects emerged from the crowd, not by accusation, but by inevitability. First, Julien Montrevel, the groom. He sat rigidly in an armchair, his grief raw and unmistakable. His hands were clenched so tightly his knuckles had gone white. "You loved your wife deeply, did you not, monsieur?" Poirot asked softly. Julien swallowed. "With my whole heart. This is madness. I would have given my life for hers." Poirot nodded sympathetically, but his eyes lingered on the man's expression, not sorrow alone, but something like shock layered with disbelief. As though events had unfolded not merely tragically, but unexpectedly. Next stood Madame Renée Armand, Elise's aunt and closest living relative. A severe woman dressed in mourning black silk, black she had chosen long before the ceremony. Her lips were thin, her gaze unwavering. "My niece was complicated," she said crisply. "Sensitive. Prone to dramatics. But she did not deserve this." "Non," Poirot agreed. "No one does." Yet he noted how Madame Armand's eyes flicked, just briefly, toward the groom before returning to him. Then there was Lucien Moreau, Julien's lifelong friend and best man. Charming, polished, too quick with reassuring smiles. He spoke easily, volunteering information before being asked. "I was with Julien most of the morning," he said. "Ensuring everything went smoothly." Elise seemed tense, yes, but brides often are. Poirot's mustaches twitched. "Indeed. Yet not all brides choose black veils, monsieur." Lucien laughed lightly. "An artistic flourish, perhaps?" Elise was known for her flair. "Known." Past tense. Poirot moved on. Clara Vienne, Elise's maid and confidante, stood wringing her hands. Her eyes were red from crying, her voice trembling. She wasn't afraid, Clara insisted. She was determined. "That morning," she told me, she stopped herself abruptly. "Told you what?" Poirot asked gently. Clara shook her head. "Nothing. Only that today would change everything." A phrase that lingered heavily in the air. Then came Etienne Valois, Julien's cousin and financial advisor. A thin man with sharp features and sharper eyes. He adjusted his spectacles nervously as he spoke. "This is a dreadful shock. For the family, for the estate. Everything Elise stood to inherit." Poirot raised a hand. "We are not yet discussing inheritance, monsieur." Valois flushed. "Of course. Forgive me." But Poirot did not miss the emphasis placed on assets rather than affection. Last among the central figures was Isabelle Fournier, a childhood friend of Elise, seated slightly apart from the others. Her expression was unreadable, neither hysterical nor overtly grief-stricken. "You were close to the bride?" Poirot asked. "Yes," Isabelle replied quietly. "Closer than most." "And yet," Poirot observed, "you do not seem surprised." Her eyes met his calmly. "I am not surprised that someone wished her dead. Only that they succeeded today." A murmur rippled through the room. Julien surged to his feet. "How dare you?" Poirot intervened smoothly. "Peace, monsieur. Mademoiselle Fournier merely speaks her truth. And truth, however uncomfortable, is my ally." He turned back to the group as a whole. "Mesdames et messieurs, you were all present today. You all had access to the bride before this ceremony. And every one of you," Poirot said evenly, "has something you have not yet told me." Silence answered him. Outside, the sun dipped lower, casting elongated shadows through the curtained windows. The joyous afternoon had already begun to decay into something darker. Poirot folded his hands once more, satisfied. The circle was closed. The game had begun. Section 3, Poirot arrives. If panic had a sound, it would have been the restless shifting of feet in the grand salon of Château Valenquet. People spoke in whispers now, as though loud voices might summon accusation. Chairs had been drawn into uneasy clusters. No one sat comfortably. Grief, suspicion, and calculation coexisted in the same confined air, each disguising itself behind manners learned over generations. Hercule Poirot alone appeared entirely at ease. He stood near a small writing desk, methodically removing his gloves, smoothing them, and placing them inside his coat with ceremonial precision. The simple act seemed almost defiant, a declaration that chaos would not be allowed to reign unchallenged. Captain Hastings watched him with a mixture of relief and awe. "You seem remarkably calm, Poirot. Given the circumstances." Poirot glanced at him mildly. "Calm, yes. Indifferent, no. Emotion clouds judgment, Hastings. Order clarifies it. And at this moment, order is very much required." The magistrate cleared his throat. "Monsieur Poirot, perhaps you would like to explain to everyone exactly why you are so certain this was murder." Poirot inclined his head politely. "With pleasure." He stepped forward, positioning himself so that he could see every face at once. This, Hastings knew, was deliberate. Poirot preferred his audience arranged like a chessboard. "The noise you heard," Poirot began, "was not a gunshot, though it imitated one closely enough. A small device, perhaps a ceremonial firecracker, perhaps something more refined, was triggered at the exact moment the poison took effect. Its purpose was distraction. To ensure confusion. To give the illusion of sudden violence rather than slow, calculated intent." Julian Montrevel looked up sharply. "You're saying my wife was already dying before that sound?" "Oui. Her body reacted instantly, but the poison had been administered earlier. Minutes, perhaps longer. Enough time for it to dissolve unnoticed." Madame Armand folded her arms. "And you know this how, monsieur? You are not a doctor." Poirot smiled faintly. "No. But I am a student of human nature, and of patterns. Certain poisons act with theatrical precision. They appeal to minds that appreciate symbolism." He gestured gently toward the memory of the black veil. No one missed the implication. The veil, Poirot continued, was not chosen on a whim. It announced tragedy before tragedy occurred. Someone wished this death to be remembered. Witnessed. Discussed. Isabelle Fournier spoke quietly. "Elise said once that if she were ever to die, she wanted the truth to stand in plain sight. Hidden, but visible." Poirot's eyes sharpened. "Ah. You see? Even the victim understood the nature of the game being played." Etienne Valois shifted in his seat. "Are you suggesting suicide? That she orchestrated her own death?" Poirot turned to him at once. "No, monsieur. Suicide lacks one essential element present here." "And what is that?" "Deception." Poirot paced slowly as he spoke, his footsteps measured. "This crime required preparation, timing, and, most importantly, an audience. Suicide seeks escape. Murder seeks control." Lucien Moreau laughed nervously. "This all sounds terribly dramatic. Surely we should wait for evidence before." Poirot stopped walking. "Evidence, monsieur, is already speaking. You are merely not listening." The best man's smile faltered. Poirot resumed. "Before the ceremony, the bride was attended by several people. Her maid. Her relatives. Her closest friends. She drank tea. She accepted a small glass of champagne, purely symbolic, I am told. She adjusted her veil more than once." Clara gasped softly. I helped her drink the tea." Poirot raised a calming hand. "I do not accuse, mademoiselle. I observe. The poison could have been administered by accident, or design, by anyone who had access to her personal space." Julian stood abruptly. "You're saying one of us, one of her own family, killed her?" Poirot met his gaze steadily. I am saying that whoever did this knew Elise well. Knew her habits. Her schedule. Her symbolism. Madame Armand's voice was cold. She had enemies. People who resented her. Resentment, Poirot replied, is common. Opportunity is rarer. He turned to Hastings. Mon ami, what do you notice? Hastings hesitated, then gestured uncertainly. Everyone seems guarded. As though they're afraid of saying too much. Poirot nodded approvingly. Exactly. Innocence is often careless. Guilt is meticulous. A flicker passed across more than one face. The magistrate exhaled slowly. Then what are you proposing, Monsieur Poirot? That we proceed not with force, Poirot said smoothly, but with conversation. I will speak to each of you. Privately. Calmly. And I will ask questions that appear harmless. He smiled, though there was little warmth in it. And you will answer them. Because you believe that words can protect you. He straightened his cuffs. They cannot. Outside, the first hint of evening crept over the chateau. Somewhere above them, Elise Montreville lay silent, her secrets waiting patiently to be uncovered. Poirot's little grey cells were already at work. And they were very pleased indeed. Section 4, Initial Interviews. Poirot insisted on conducting the interviews in a small morning room adjacent to the salon, intimate, well-lit, and comfortably furnished. He believed people spoke more freely when surrounded by civility. Guilt, after all, preferred politeness to pressure. One by one, the suspects were invited inside. Julien Montreville. The groom sat stiffly on the edge of the chair, his posture betraying exhaustion rather than collapse. Poirot noted this at once. You loved your wife, Poirot began gently. Tell me, was she happy to marry you? Julien hesitated. A fraction too long. She believed it was necessary, he said carefully. For stability. For the family. Necessary, Poirot repeated softly. Not joyful? Julien ran a hand through his hair. Elise was not naive. She understood what this marriage represented. And what did it represent, monsieur? A resolution. Poirot's eyes lifted. To what conflict? Julien exhaled sharply. There were complications before we met. Matters she wished behind her. Yet, Poirot said mildly, she wore a black veil. One does not signal an ending while celebrating a beginning. Julien looked away. I did not choose the veil. Poirot made a small note. Madame Renée Armand. She entered with composure, seated herself without invitation, and folded her hands neatly. My niece was difficult, she said at once. Strong-willed. Emotionally indulgent. You disapproved of the marriage? Poirot asked. I approved of its outcome, she corrected. The Montreville name would protect her. And us. Us? The family estate is fragile. Poirot tilted his head. Did Elise know this? Madame Armand's lips tightened. She knew everything. Did she wish to marry? She wished to stop fighting. Poirot nodded. And yet someone ensured she never would. Madame Armand's gaze did not waver. But her fingers tightened imperceptibly. Lucien Moreau. Lucien entered with practiced ease, though his eyes darted briefly to the window. You were the groom's closest friend, Poirot said. And the bride's? Lucien smiled. We were friendly. Not close? Not, personally. Poirot leaned back. You were with Monsieur Montreville most of the morning. Who, then, was with the bride? Lucien shrugged lightly. Her maid. Her aunt. Friends. Many people. Yes, Poirot agreed. Too many, perhaps. Lucien laughed. Are you suggesting chaos? I am suggesting, Poirot replied evenly, that you prefer not to remember details. Lucien's smile faded. Clara Vienne. The maid entered trembling. You loved your mistress, Poirot said kindly. Yes, monsieur. She was good to me. Did she seem afraid today? Clara shook her head. No. Calm. Almost, resolved. Did she say anything unusual? Clara hesitated, then whispered, she said I must remember her exactly as she was today. Poirot's eyes sharpened. And how was that? Certain. Etienne Valois. The advisor adjusted his spectacles repeatedly. You managed the Montrevel finances, Poirot said. Yes. For years. And did this marriage benefit the estate? Immensely. Did it benefit Elise? Valois paused. In time. Poirot smiled thinly. Time she was never given. Isabelle Fournier. She sat calmly, hands folded, eyes clear. You were her confidant, Poirot said. What was she afraid of? Isabelle met his gaze. Being silenced. Poirot leaned forward. By whom? Isabelle answered quietly, by marriage. Silence filled the room. When the interviews ended, Poirot remained seated, fingers steepled. Each story was polite. Logical. Reasonable. And each contained a fracture, small, deliberate, and carefully disguised. He rose slowly. They all believe, Poirot murmured to Hastings, that they have said too little to be caught. Poirot smiled faintly. In truth, they have said far too much. The first threads had been drawn tight. And soon, very soon, one of them would snap. Section 5, The First False Lead. The autopsy report arrived just after dusk. Poirot read it carefully, his expression serene, while the magistrate paced the length of the study, impatience radiating from every step. Fast-acting alkaloid, the magistrate said, tapping the paper. Rare, but not impossible to obtain. Administered orally. Death within minutes. Minutes, Poirot echoed softly. A generous window. The magistrate stopped pacing. Which narrows the list considerably. The maid served tea. The bride drank it. That seems straightforward. Hastings stiffened. Clara was devoted to her mistress. Devotion does not preclude fear, the magistrate replied. Nor manipulation. Poirot folded the report neatly. Monsieur, may I ask, do you enjoy simple solutions? The magistrate frowned. I enjoy correct ones. Ah, Poirot said gently, but simplicity and correctness are not always companions. Nevertheless, the pressure for resolution was immediate. Clara Vienne was brought in again, pale, shaking, her eyes wide with disbelief as the implication settled over her. She protested weakly, her words tumbling over one another. I would never harm her. Never. She trusted me. She trusted you enough to drink what you gave her, the magistrate said grimly. The room seemed to contract. Poirot watched Clara carefully. Her terror was unguarded. Chaotic. Inelegant. Guilt, Poirot knew, was rarely so untidy. Yet logic, cold, mechanical logic, pointed to her. Opportunity. Access. Timing. The magistrate sighed. Until further notice, mademoiselle, you are not free to leave. Clara broke down then, sobbing into her hands. Hastings leaned toward Poirot. This feels wrong. Poirot nodded slightly. Because it is. Still, the authorities were satisfied. A servant's crime was comfortable, tragic, yes, but familiar. It preserved the dignity of wealth and bloodlines. That evening, word spread quietly through the chateau, the maid had poisoned the bride. Some slept easier because of it. Poirot did not sleep at all. He stood alone in the morning room long after midnight, reviewing the scene in his mind. Elise's calm. The veil. The timing. The sound. And one detail that refused to align. The poison had been administered orally. Yet the bride had adjusted her veil repeatedly before the ceremony. A gesture of habit, or necessity. The next morning brought disruption. A scream echoed through the east wing. Poirot was already moving when a servant collided with him in the corridor. "Monsieur." "The study, Etienne Valois, he's gone." "Gone." "Not dead." "Not missing." "Gone." The door to Valois' study stood open. Papers lay scattered across the desk. A ledger was missing. On the blotter lay a single object. A small glass vial. Empty. Poirot picked it up delicately, examining it in the light. "This," he said quietly, "is not the poison that killed Elise Montrevel." Hastings stared. "Then what is it?" Poirot smiled thinly. "A decoy." Outside, the chateau stirred with renewed anxiety. The false certainty of Clara's guilt had already begun to dissolve. Someone had fled. And someone else had wanted them to. Poirot straightened, his mind racing. "The trap," he murmured, "has been sprung far too early." Which meant only one thing. The real murderer was still inside the circle. And now, they were afraid. Section 6, The Psychological Game. Fear is a powerful accelerator. By mid-morning, it had seeped into every corner of Chateau Valenquet. Servants whispered in doorways. Guests avoided one another's eyes. The disappearance of Etienne Valois had shattered the fragile comfort provided by Clara's convenient arrest. A false solution, Poirot knew, always produced movement. And movement produced mistakes. Poirot requested, politely, insistently, that everyone remain for breakfast in the small dining hall. It was an odd demand, but no one refused. Refusal itself would have been suspicious. He took his seat at the head of the table, immaculate as ever, folding his napkin with precision. Hastings sat beside him, watching the others with growing unease. Julien Montrevel barely touched his food. Madame Armande ate sparingly, her posture rigid. Lucien Moreau joked too loudly, his laughter echoing hullily. Isabelle Fournier sipped her coffee in silence. Poirot began casually. "It is curious, is it not, how tragedy rearranges priorities? Last night, the maid was the villain. This morning, she is merely inconvenient." Lucien chuckled. "You mean Valois? He's run off to save his own skin, I imagine." "Perhaps," Poirot replied mildly. "Or perhaps he was meant to." Madame Armande looked up sharply. "Meant to?" Poirot buttered his toast with care. "Yes. Someone wished him to disappear. To draw attention. To validate a false narrative." Julien slammed his hand on the table. "Enough of these games. If you believe one of us is responsible, say so." Poirot met his gaze calmly. "Impatience, monsieur, is rarely the trait of the innocent." Julien flushed but said nothing. Poirot turned his attention to Isabelle. "Mademoiselle Fournier, you said yesterday that Elise feared being silenced by marriage. Why?" Isabelle answered without hesitation. "Because she had discovered something. Something she intended to reveal after the ceremony." Lucien laughed nervously. "Always drama with Elise." Poirot's eyes flicked to him. "And yet you laugh, monsieur, when drama has just claimed a life." Lucien's laughter died abruptly. Poirot continued, still conversational. "Let us imagine, purely as an exercise, that Elise wished to protect herself. She knew she was in danger. She might choose a symbolic gesture, a black veil, perhaps, to signal distress without alerting the guilty party. Madame Armand stiffened. You suggest she knew she would be killed? I suggest, Poirot said, that she suspected. He turned to Hastings. Mon ami, if a woman feared poison, where might she hide it? Hastings frowned. Hide poison? Or its antidote? Realization flickered across Hastings' face. On her person. Poirot nodded. Specifically, somewhere intimate. Somewhere only she would touch. Eyes around the table widened. The veil, Poirot said softly. The bride adjusted it repeatedly. Not from nerves, but to ensure contact. Julian's face drained of color. You think the veil was poisoned? Not poisoned, Poirot corrected. Prepared. With a delayed-acting compound transferred gradually through the skin or lips. Madame Armand rose abruptly. That is absurd. Poirot regarded her coolly. Absurdity is often a refuge. He rose as well. The poison was not in the tea. That was theater. The true delivery was intimate, deliberate, and required knowledge of Elise's habits. Lucien's voice shook. Then why frame the maid? Because servants are invisible, Poirot replied. And because someone needed time. To do what? Julian demanded. Poirot smiled thinly. To escape, or to redirect suspicion. At that moment, a constable entered hurriedly. Monsieur Poirot. A message from the railway station. Etienne Valois was found. Everyone froze. Alive? Hastings asked. The constable hesitated. Barely. He attempted to take his own life. Poirot closed his eyes briefly. The psychological game had reached its next stage. Someone, somewhere in that room, had just realized their plan was unraveling. And fear, Poirot knew, would not let them stay silent for long. Section 7, Another Crime, Another Truth. Etienne Valois did not die. That fact alone altered the balance of the investigation. Poirot insisted on seeing him at once. The magistrate agreed, though reluctantly, and by early afternoon Poirot and Hastings were driven to the small provincial hospital where Valois lay under guard. Rain had begun to fall, a fine, persistent drizzle that softened the countryside and dulled the world into shades of grey. Valois was conscious when they entered, though weak. His face was ashen, his eyes hollow with exhaustion rather than remorse. You attempted suicide, Poirot said gently, pulling a chair to the bedside. That is, dramatic. Valois swallowed. You think I ran because I was guilty. I ran because I was afraid. Of whom? Poirot asked. Valois hesitated, then laughed bitterly. Of the truth. And of the people who would do anything to bury it. Poirot leaned forward. Then help me unearth it. Silence stretched. Finally, Valois spoke. Elise discovered irregularities in the Montrevel accounts. Long-standing ones. Funds moved, redirected. Inheritance structures altered quietly. All legal, barely, but immoral. Who benefited? Hastings asked. Valois closed his eyes. Julian, and Madame Armand. The marriage consolidated everything. After the wedding, Elise planned to confront them. She told me so herself. Poirot's gaze sharpened. Yet you fled. Yes, Valois whispered. Because the night before the wedding, Elise gave me something for safekeeping. Proof. She said if anything happened to her, I was to give it to you. Me? Poirot asked softly. You, Valois nodded. She trusted your reputation. And what did you do instead? Poirot asked. Valois' voice cracked. I panicked. When the maid was accused, I thought, perhaps it would end there. But then I realized someone would come for me next. Poirot rose slowly. Someone already has. Back at Chateau Valenquet, the atmosphere had curdled into open hostility. The news of Valois' survival spread quickly, and so did the implications. Poirot requested one final gathering. This time, there were no protests. They assembled in the grand salon once more. Rain streaked the tall windows like tears. Poirot stood before them, composed, inexorable. Mesdames et messieurs, he began, yesterday you witnessed a murder designed to look impulsive, dramatic, and sudden. In truth, it was none of those things. Julien's jaw tightened. The poison was applied to the inner edge of the veil, Poirot continued. A compound absorbed gradually. It required familiarity with Elise's attire, her habits, her trust. Madame Armand's hands trembled, just once. The maid was framed. Valois was driven to flight. Both served the same purpose, delay. Poirot turned to Isabelle Fournier. You knew Elise feared exposure. Yes, Isabelle replied quietly. She intended to speak after the ceremony. She believed the public setting would protect her. Poirot nodded sadly. She misjudged the ruthlessness of those closest to her. Julien exploded. This is insanity. Where is your proof? Poirot reached into his coat. This, he said, producing a sealed envelope, was given to me this morning. The documents Elise entrusted to Valois before her death. He placed it on the table. Financial records. Altered wills. Evidence of coercion. Madame Armand rose slowly. You cannot prove who poisoned her. Poirot smiled, thin, precise. Non, he said. Not yet. He looked around the room, his eyes resting on each face in turn. But one of you already knows that I can. And in that moment, just for an instant, Poirot saw it. The flicker of terror. The truth had revealed itself. The final act was ready to begin. Section 8, Poirot's hidden clue. Poirot did not reveal the truth at once. Instead, he did something far more unsettling. He waited. The suspects remained gathered in the grand salon, but the atmosphere had shifted from outrage to something colder and sharper. Silence pressed in on them, broken only by the faint ticking of a gilt mantel clock. Each second sounded deliberate, accusatory. Poirot stood near the window, gazing out at the rain-soaked gardens where white roses now sagged beneath the weight of water. The place of joy had become a place of reckoning. Why do you delay? Julien Montrevel demanded at last. You claim to know. Then speak. Poirot did not turn. Because, monsieur, certainty is a fragile thing. If revealed too soon, it can be denied. If revealed too late, it can be escaped. He faced them slowly. There is one detail, Poirot continued, that has troubled me from the beginning. Not dramatic. Not emotional. Merely, incorrect. Madame Armand's voice was tight. You have already accused us all in spirit. Spirit, yes, Poirot replied calmly. But not in fact. He gestured toward a side table where Elise's personal effects had been placed by the police, her gloves, a small clutch purse, a silver compact, and, carefully folded, the black veil. This veil, Poirot said, lifting it delicately, was central to the crime. Yet everyone assumed its purpose too quickly. Lucien scoffed weakly. You already explained, it carried the poison. Oui, Poirot agreed. But that is not the detail. He held the veil up to the light. Observe the lace. Fine. Imported. Very expensive. Hand-finished. Julien frowned. Elise had exquisite taste. Indeed. Yet taste is not the issue. Poirot pointed with a gloved finger. Look here. Along the seam. Hastings leaned closer. It's reinforced. Exactly, Poirot said softly. Strengthened with a modern synthetic thread. Invisible unless you look for it. Isabelle frowned. What does that mean? It means, Poirot replied, that the veil was altered recently. Not purchased that way. Modified. Madame Armand's breath caught, just slightly. Poirot continued relentlessly. The poison was applied to a specific section, where the bride would instinctively touch while adjusting it. That required knowledge not only of chemistry, but of habit. Of intimacy. He placed the veil down. And one more thing. The poison chosen causes a faint scent, bitter almonds. You remember? Several heads nodded uneasily. Yet Elise noticed nothing. Why? Poirot asked. No one answered. Because, Poirot said, the veil already carried a competing scent. A familiar one. Something comforting. He turned sharply. Lavender. Hastings blinked. Her perfume? Non, Poirot corrected. Someone else's. He looked directly at Madame Renée Armand. Lavender sachets. Old-fashioned. Used to store fine garments. The room seemed to shrink. You altered the veil, Poirot said calmly. You handled it long enough to reinforce the seam, apply the poison, and mask its odor. Elise trusted you. You dressed in black long before the wedding because you knew how the day would end. Julian rose unsteadily. Aunt Renée, this is absurd. Poirot raised a hand. One moment more, monsieur. He turned back to the group. The hidden clue was not financial. Nor chemical. Nor theatrical. Poirot's voice softened. It was emotional. Only one person in this room loved Elise enough to touch her veil without permission, and feared her enough to silence her forever. Madame Armand's composure finally cracked. Not into hysteria. Into something colder. You always think love excuses cruelty, she said quietly. You are wrong. Poirot closed his eyes briefly. No, he said. I think fear does. The final gathering was inevitable now. And the truth, long resisted, was ready to be spoken aloud. Section 9, The Final Gathering. Poirot requested that everyone be seated. Not suggested, requested, with that quiet authority that admitted no refusal. Chairs were drawn into a loose semicircle facing the fireplace, as though for an intimate recital rather than an accusation of murder. The rain outside had intensified, drumming steadily against the tall windows, sealing the chateau in sound and shadow. Poirot stood before them, hands lightly clasped behind his back. This, he said calmly, is the moment when confusion ends. From now on, there will be only logic. No one spoke. Poirot began, as he always did, at the beginning, but not the beginning they expected. Elise Armand was not murdered because she was weak, Poirot said. She was murdered because she had become strong. Julian stiffened. She discovered financial manipulation, Poirot continued, yes. But that alone would not have killed her. Money crimes are exposed every day. No, what made her dangerous was her timing. He turned slowly, ensuring each face was seen. She intended to reveal the truth after the ceremony. Publicly. In front of witnesses who could not be silenced. The wedding was meant to protect her. Poirot paused. It did not. Lucien Moreau shifted in his chair. You still haven't explained why you're so certain it was Madame Armand. Poirot inclined his head. I will. But first, let us remove the distractions. He gestured toward Hastings. Mon ami, tell them what Valois confirmed. Hastings spoke clearly. The financial scheme benefited Julien Montrevel and Madame Armand. The marriage would have sealed it permanently. Julian leapt to his feet. That proves nothing about murder. Sit down, Poirot said quietly. Julian did. Poirot continued. Julian, you are guilty of many things: cowardice, moral convenience, silence. But not murder. Julian stared at him, stunned. You lacked the imagination, Poirot said gently. And the patience. He turned next to Lucien. Monsieur Moreau, you are guilty of opportunism. You knew of Elise's doubts. You encouraged harmony, calm, delay. You believed the storm would pass. Lucien swallowed. I never touched her veil. Just so, Poirot agreed. Finally, Poirot faced Madame Renée Armand. You, he said softly, are guilty of certainty. Madame Armand did not look away. You raised Elise, Poirot continued. You guided her. Controlled her. And when she outgrew your authority, you mistook independence for betrayal. Madame Armand smiled thinly. I protected her. No, Poirot corrected. You owned her. The word struck the room like a blow. You knew Elise's habits, Poirot went on. You supervised her wardrobe. You stored her veil with lavender sachets, your lavender. You reinforced the seam under the pretense of care. And you applied the poison where only she would touch it. Madame Armand's voice was calm. You cannot prove I did it alone. Poirot nodded. I do not need to. He stepped closer. You did not act in anger. You acted in terror, terror of exposure, of disgrace, of losing control. And when you realized the maid would be blamed, you allowed it. When Valois fled, you counted on his silence. Poirot straightened. But you miscalculated one thing. Madame Armand raised an eyebrow. Only one? Poirot's voice was almost gentle. You underestimated Elise. The room fell utterly silent. She wore black not to mourn, Poirot said. But to warn. She placed herself at the center of attention so that her death could not be dismissed as private tragedy. And she entrusted proof to Valois, knowing she might not live. Poirot stepped back, allowing the truth to breathe. The crime is complete, he said. The logic is whole. He turned to the magistrate. You may proceed. All eyes fixed on Madame Armand. For the first time, her composure failed. Not with tears. With a slow, exhausted sigh. Very well, she said quietly. Finish it, Monsieur Poirot. And so he did. Section 10, The Reveal, Justice, and Farewell. Poirot did not raise his voice. He never did at the moment of victory. Madame Armand, he said quietly, there is one question left unanswered. Why choose poison? Why such precision? Madame Renée Armand sat very still. The room waited. Because, she replied at last, poison is intimate. It does not shout. It whispers. Poirot nodded. Just so. You did not wish to appear violent. You wished to appear inevitable. She drew a slow breath. Elise believed herself clever. Brave. She thought exposure would free her. A bitter smile touched her lips. She did not understand the cost of scandal. The ruin it brings, not only to the guilty, but to everyone bound to them. You feared disgrace, Poirot said. I feared destruction, Madame Armand corrected. Families do not survive truth as easily as detectives believe. Poirot regarded her sadly. And so you chose to destroy her instead. Her composure finally crumbled, not into hysteria, but into weariness. I raised her from childhood. I shaped her. And when she slipped beyond my control, I panicked. Poirot inclined his head. Fear again. The magistrate stepped forward. Madame Renée Armand, you are under arrest for the murder of Elise Montreville. she did not resist. As the officers approached, she rose with dignity, smoothing the front of her dress. She wore the black veil, Madame Armand said quietly, almost to herself. I thought it melodrama. I see now, it was defiance. Poirot met her gaze. It was courage. She was led away. Silence lingered long after the doors closed. Julien Montrevel sat as though carved from stone. I did nothing, he said hoarsely. And yet. I am ruined. Poirot turned to him. You are alive. And you have been given truth. Do not waste either. Julien bowed his head. Lucien Moreau exhaled shakily, relief and shame warring on his face. Isabelle Fournier closed her eyes, a single tear escaping. Outside, the rain finally eased. Later, as evening settled gently over Chateau Valenquet, Poirot and Hastings prepared to depart. The garden had been tidied, the roses lifted, but the joy that once lived there would not soon return. At the gate, Hastings spoke softly. She planned for her own death. Poirot adjusted his hat. She planned for truth, mon ami. Death was the price imposed by fear. They walked on. Do you think, Hastings asked, that justice was done? Poirot paused, looking back once more at the chateau. Justice, he said, is rarely perfect. But today, it was honest. He smiled faintly. And that, for human nature, is no small achievement. With that, Hercule Poirot turned away, his mustaches impeccable, his little grey cells at peace, leaving behind a wedding that became a warning, and a black veil that told the truth too late, yet loudly enough to be heard forever.